During a fiery primetime debate, conservative commentator Charlie Kirk mocks New York State Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani in an attempt to publicly discredit him. But Mamdani stuns everyone with a calm, powerful sentence that instantly flips the narrative, silencing Kirk and leaving the entire studio speechless. What he said is now going viral across America. The studio was tense. The on-air lights were glowing. The sleek set, usually filled with scripted sound bites, now crackled with raw anticipation. It was supposed to be a standard debate on the future of the American economy, but everyone knew something deeper simmered beneath. Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist from Queens, sat composed, his eyes locked on his opponent. Across the desk, Charlie Kirk leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, already preparing his verbal dagger. "Assemblyman," Kirk began, his voice oozing sarcasm, "I must ask, how does it feel to champion an ideology that has a perfect 100% record of failure? You socialists talk a great game about helping people, but your policies only ever seem to create more poverty and less freedom." A few chuckles rippled through the small, divided studio audience. Zohran didn't flinch. The camera zoomed in. The silence that followed was thick. That's when Kirk leaned in mockingly. "Do you even understand basic supply and demand, Mr. Mamdani?" The studio froze, but Zohran didn't. He blinked slowly, then looked up. His lips parted, and what he said next didn't come yet, but every heart in the room already knew. Something huge was coming. Something that would change everything. Charlie Kirk smirked like a man in full control. "Mr. Mamdani," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "maybe if you'd spent less time organizing tenants and more time reading an economics textbook, you'd understand how the real world works." Laughter from Kirk's side of the audience echoed in the studio. Bloggers started typing furiously. The camera zoomed in again. Zohran didn't look at the audience or the moderator. He slowly turned to Kirk, his voice still calm. "I came here tonight to talk about the truth of our economy," Zohran said steadily. "But it seems some people wouldn't recognize the truth if it served them an eviction notice." That quieted the room for a second. Kirk rolled his eyes. "Truth coming from a socialist, please." Zohran smiled just a little, then reached into his folder, pulling out not a government document, but a professionally printed annual report. "I wasn't going to bring this up," he said softly, "but since we're talking about the truth of the real world," he slid the paper forward, then looked Kirk dead in the eyes. Every eye was on Zohran Mamdani, every camera turned. Kirk's smile faltered just slightly. Zohran tapped the document with his finger. Then he said it, the sentence clear, cold, delivered like a dagger dipped in ice. "While you mock my work for tenants, Mr. Kirk, your organization's largest corporate donor is listed right here. The same private equity firm that is currently trying to evict over 5,000 families from their rent-stabilized homes in the Bronx." Boom! The studio erupted. Gasps from the audience, a sharp inhale from the moderator. Someone in the production booth dropped their headset. Kirk's face drained of color. That's a smear. How did you? Zohran stood slowly, calmly. "I got this from the tenant union organizers who have been fighting this firm for months. They brought it to me in tears, ashamed of how a system you celebrate is trying to make them invisible." Silence, pure, crushing. Kirk stumbled over his words, trying to form a sentence, but none came because everyone now saw what Zohran saw, the truth, and America was about to see it too. Chaos. That was the only word to describe the studio. The moderator was trying to restore order. Let's take a break." But the echo of Zohran's sentence still hung like smoke after a fire. Charlie Kirk's face twitched. His hands trembled. Phones buzzed. Alerts flew across screens nationwide. Breaking news: Zohran Mamdani exposes Kirk's donors in live debate. In the control room, a producer whispered, "Did he just?" "Yes," said the director, stunned. "He did." Zohran remained standing, still composed. "This document isn't just evidence," he said, holding the folder higher for the camera. "It's a mirror. For every American watching, this is what happens when so-called populists mock the working class while taking money from the billionaires who crush them. This is what happens when they think no one is watching the money trail. Tears welled in the eyes of a young housing activist from Queens, watching from a crowded community center in Astoria. Kirk suddenly stood. "This is a fabrication. Desperation," Zohran cut in softly. "No, Mr. Kirk, I'm just telling the truth. Something you haven't done for years." The room gasped again. This wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point, and the storm was only beginning. Millions were now watching as networks cut into live coverage. Charlie Kirk reached for his water, his hands shaking. "I demand a commercial break," he shouted, but his voice cracked. Zohran didn't sit down. He opened the folder again and pulled out a second document. It was a photograph. "This isn't just their name on a list, Charlie. This is the Rivera family." He held the photo of a mother, father, and two small children to the camera. "Your patrons sent them an eviction notice last week. I didn't want to expose this here, but when you mocked me in front of America, you mocked every family who still believes they have a right to a home." And suddenly, Kirk slumped in his chair, broken. It was no longer just a TV debate, it was a reckoning. In a small apartment in the Bronx, a mother of three who had just received an eviction notice from that same firm wiped tears from her face as she watched Zohran speak truth to power. In a hospital break room in Brooklyn, a nurse paused her meal and turned the TV volume up. In a dusty union hall in Queens, silence fell. Grown men stared at the screen, choking on emotion. Back in the studio, Zohran continued, "You didn't steal from billionaires, Charlie. Through your donors, you're helping to steal from single moms, from veterans, from people who still had hope." Kirk tried to stand, but his knees buckled. His aide rushed to the stage. Zohran stepped forward, not as a politician, but as a defender, a neighbor, a son of Queens. "I don't say this to hurt you. I say it because the truth still matters. And you tried to humiliate me, but all you did was remind me who I fight for." A tear slid down Zohran's cheek. That moment broke the studio, and as the nation watched, hearts shattered, not just for the scandal, but for the kind of fierce, community-driven courage they'd forgotten still existed. News traveled faster than wildfire. Within minutes, the clip of Zohran Mamdani exposing Kirk's hypocrisy hit social media. One post, liked hundreds of thousands of times, read, "Zohran Mamdani just ended Charlie Kirk's career on live TV with a single receipt." Trending hashtags exploded. #Kirk exposed, #tenant power, #Zohran. Reporters crowded the TV studio's exit, yelling questions. Backstage, the on-air chaos had passed, but a quiet storm now brewed. "I wasn't trying to win a debate," Zohran whispered to a young tenant organizer from his team. "I just wanted to make them listen to you." In a small apartment in Astoria, Queens, a family watched the clip on a laptop. The grandmother, who had lived in the building for 40 years, turned to her daughter. "He has no fear," she said in Bengali. "He speaks for us." Meanwhile, in Kirk's green room, he refused to speak. His aides whispered, sweating. His phone buzzed with messages. Lawyers, donors, panicked allies. Zohran didn't smile. His heart was heavy. He knew this wasn't just politics. This was people's lives. In the studio hallway, a security guard, an older man from the Dominican Republic, paused to shake Zohran's hand. "You spoke for my family in Washington Heights," he said, his eyes full. "You told the truth when it was hard." And Zohran, the assemblyman from Queens, simply nodded. Because this wasn't about applause. It was about a city waking up. Backstage, Zohran's phone vibrated nonstop. The calls weren't from governors or senators, but from union leaders, housing activists, teachers, and bodega owners from his district. One call came from a social worker in the Bronx. "I just showed the clip to a family that firm is trying to evict," she said, her voice cracking. "Their little girl asked me, 'Does this mean we can stay?' You gave them hope, Zohran." His eyes misted. He turned to his legislative director. "Get me the state attorney general's office, first thing tomorrow. We have the proof. I want them to launch a formal inquiry into this firm's predatory practices. These families deserve justice." The aide hesitated. "This will start a war with Wall Street." Zohran stood tall, then let it come. Outside, Kirk tried to leave through a side door, but reporters boxed him in. "Do you deny the donations? Do you support their eviction tactics?" He snapped, "No comment," but the panic in his voice told another story. Inside, the studio emptied slowly, but one young production assistant lingered. She approached Zohran with tears in her eyes. "My family was evicted by a landlord like that 3 years ago. We lost everything. You just answered a question I've been carrying ever since. Does anyone with a microphone ever fight for us?" Zohran said nothing, just met her gaze and gave her a firm, reassuring nod. That night, while the city buzzed, Zohran was scrolling through messages on his phone when he saw a public comment on his Instagram. He opened it slowly. "Dear Mr. Mamdani, my name is Sophia. I'm 10 years old. I live in Astoria. My mommy cried today watching you on TV. She said you made her feel strong again. My abuela is always scared we will have to move, but tonight you made her smile. I just wanted to say thank you." Zohran put the phone down, pressing his hand to his chest. He sat down, deeply moved. He thought of his own family, his neighborhood, the faces of Queens, the people made to feel invisible by men in distant boardrooms. It had never been about power. It was about people like Sophia and her grandmother. He turned on the TV. Kirk was on another network, denying everything, calling the report a socialist smear. But the internet wasn't buying it. Not this time. Zohran leaned back, whispering, "I didn't break the system. I just held up a mirror." Outside the TV studio, a small, impromptu crowd had gathered. Not for division, but for solidarity. They waved signs that said, "Housing is a human right," and "Thank you, Zohran." And across the city, people cried. As the sun began to dip over the Manhattan skyline, a group of off-duty taxi drivers gathered at a 24-hour diner in Jackson Heights, watching the clip on a phone propped up by a sugar dispenser. An elderly Sikh driver watched Zohran's final words, then looked at his friend. "I thought no one would ever speak for people like us again on a stage that big." Back in his small apartment, Zohran's phone rang. It was a veteran housing organizer he had known for years. "You okay, kid?" the old man's gruff voice asked. "Yes," Zohran replied, "but this got bigger than I expected." The organizer chuckled. "That's because you didn't just throw a punch. You held up a mirror. Now be ready. They're going to come for you with everything they've got." Zohran looked out the window at the endless lights of the city. "I know," he said, and he wasn't afraid. The next morning, Zohran's face was everywhere, not on attack ads, but in street art. A mural of his face appeared overnight on a wall in Bushwick. His quote was stenciled on sidewalks in the Bronx. People began repeating the sentence, "While you mock my work for tenants, your largest donor is evicting them." In coffee shops and union halls, Zohran's quiet courage was the conversation. But in the boardrooms of Manhattan, panic spread like a virus. The firm's PR team was scrambling. Lawyers were circling. Political allies were pulling away. Zohran's chief of staff walked into his district office, eyes wide. "The Real Estate Board of New York just called for an emergency meeting. They're trying to kill the good cause bill for good." Zohran nodded. "Then we'll go fight them." "But sir, their retaliation." "I'm not afraid of that," Zohran said. "I'm afraid of what happens if we stop telling the truth." At that moment, his partner called. "The kids saw you on TV," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They said Daddy looked like a superhero." Zohran's hands shook a little, not from fear, but from the weight of it all, because the truth was no longer just about Charlie Kirk. It was about every New Yorker who had ever felt silenced by a notice taped to their door. Outside his district office, a small crowd was growing. There was no shouting, just faces filled with tears and hope. One woman held a picture of her late husband. Her name was Anna. She had driven from the Bronx. She approached an aide. "Can you give this letter to Assemblyman Mamdani?" Inside, Zohran was walking to a strategy meeting when the aide handed him the note. He opened it. "My husband died of a heart attack last year. The stress of fighting our landlord was too much. We later learned the building was bought by that same firm. Today you showed my children that justice still breathes in this city. I just needed you to know. You've already changed lives, thank you." Zohran stood still. His aide whispered, "Sir, they're waiting." Zohran wiped his eyes and walked into the meeting. The room was tense. Organizers, aides, and tenants were gathered. No cameras, no script, just one man in a city watching. And somewhere outside, Anna joined a crowd of strangers, crying not from pain, but from something deeper. Hope. The meeting room fell quiet as Zohran took his seat. The entire movement seemed to hold its breath. He didn't look at his notes. His fingers tapped the table. A community organizer cleared her throat. "Zohran, before we begin, do you wish to make a statement?" Zohran stood slowly. No podium, no note cards, just his hands folded in front of him. "I didn't come here to be dramatic," Zohran said gently to the room of organizers. "I didn't come to play politics. I came because the people of this city deserve to know that someone still sees their fight." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the tired but determined faces. "We are in this room because people trusted us with their pain, their rent checks, their dreams. But when those dreams are turned into debt by corporate greed, nobody in power answers them back." He lifted the letter from Anna, the woman who drove from the Bronx. "She didn't ask for revenge, she asked for truth. I owe her that. We all do." Even some of the most battle-hardened organizers looked down, ashamed of the system they fought every day. For a brief moment, political strategy vanished. All that remained was one man standing for millions, one voice for the voiceless. A veteran organizer, a woman who had been fighting these battles since the 1970s, leaned forward. "Zohran, are you suggesting we push for criminal charges against the CEO himself?" Zohran didn't flinch. "I'm not suggesting, we are demanding." He held up a thick, red folder, sealed. Inside are documents, illegal eviction notices, timestamps, and sworn testimony from dozens of tenants. Evidence showing this firm has a deliberate, illegal strategy to harass families out of their homes. Money that should have saved jobs and repaired buildings went to fake shell companies run by their own executives. As he spoke, a phone in the room buzzed, showing a live feed. Charlie Kirk was on another network, red-faced and trembling. "This is a smear campaign," he barked. "It's all lies. None of this will hold up." Zohran didn't say a word. He simply handed the red folder to a lawyer from a local legal aid society. At that moment, the lead organizer's phone lit up. She stared at it, her mouth falling open, and held it up for the room to see. It was a push alert from the New York Times. "The state attorney general," she read aloud, her voice shaking, "has just launched a formal investigation into Vulture Capital's predatory housing practices." The room didn't gasp. It erupted in cheers, applause, and tears. On the TV screen, Kirk's chair screeched as he backed away from the desk. "This is a witch hunt," he cried. "You people are insane." Zohran calmly turned to the screen. "No, Mr. Kirk," he said softly as if to himself. "This is justice." Reporters swarmed as Kirk stormed off the set. The sound of his shoes echoing down the hallway became the symbol of the moment. He was running from the truth. Outside the firm's Manhattan headquarters, the crowd had grown. People of all races, all backgrounds. Some waved their tenant union banners. Others held signs that simply read, "Thank you, Zohran." A woman held her baby up to the cheering crowd, whispering, "They are the reason you might have a better future." And for the first time in a long, long time, New York City cried together. Because sometimes one calm sentence can shake a city. In a small emergency room in Elmhurst, Queens, Nurse Ella Reyes stood by an elderly patient's bedside. The TV in the corner played the news. The moment the Attorney General's investigation was announced played again. Ella sat on the edge of a chair, trembling. Her own family had been priced out of their neighborhood last year. The elderly patient, barely conscious, whispered in Spanish, "That man, he speaks for us." Ella nodded. "He does." Then she cried, not out of anger, but relief. In that sterile room full of beeping machines, Hope had walked in through a television screen. She picked up her phone and texted one word to her sister. "Watch." Because sometimes a moment on TV doesn't feel real until it touches your own family. And Zohran Mamdani had done just that. After the rally, Zohran returned to his district office. No applause, just his team quietly absorbing the moment. His phone rang. It was the veteran organizer. "You just made history, kid," the gruff voice said. Zohran replied, "I wasn't trying to." The organizer chuckled. "That's exactly why you did." There was a pause. Then his tone shifted. "They're gonna come hard now. The real estate lobby, Wall Street. the conservative press. You ready for that? Zohran looked out the window at the streets of Queens. I'm ready, when he said, because this isn't about me. It's about what we tell the next generation. If their homes matter, if the truth matters. Across New York, something rare was happening. People were feeling. At a halal cart in Midtown, a vendor gave a free soda to a customer watching the clip. In a barbershop in Harlem, an old black man stood from his stool and whispered, "That boy, Zohran, he's got the soul of the movement." In living rooms and union halls, the same sentence echoed. While you mock my work for tenants, your largest donor is evicting them. And Zohran Mamdani, still in his office, hands folded, quiet. An elderly woman who volunteered at the office, a respected community elder, stopped and put her hand on his shoulder. Zohran stood up. "Thank you," he said. "No," the woman replied, eyes wet. "Thank you for making us feel powerful again." That night, while the city lit up with headlines and hashtags, an email arrived in Zohran's public inbox. No subject line. He opened it slowly. Attached was a scanned photo of a young man in a construction worker's uniform holding a toddler. The email was short. "Mr. Mamdani, my husband died of a heart attack waiting for a housing voucher. He worked with honor, but our paperwork was always lost. Then I found out our building was owned by a firm like that. Today I watched you speak, and for the first time I didn't feel invisible. You gave my husband back his dignity even if he's gone. Please don't stop." Zohran placed his hand on the screen like it was sacred. He stared at the construction worker's face. Then he stood, quiet, angry, steady. Because this wasn't politics anymore. This was about what we owe to those who gave everything. Outside his office the next morning, a crowd kept growing. No chants, just presence. Among them was a boy in a wheelchair named Leo, 10 years old. His mom had brought him from the South Bronx. His family had been forced into an apartment with toxic mold after an illegal eviction, making his asthma dangerously worse. Leo sat quietly holding a sign that read, "A safe home is healthcare. Thank you for fighting." Leo had written Zohran a note too, but he couldn't get through the crowd to hand it to him, so he sat quietly holding his sign. A news camera caught him. The clip aired citywide. By morning, all of New York knew his name. Inside his office, Zohran was briefed. "Sir, there's a boy outside with a sign. It's going viral." Zohran paused. "What's his name?" "Leo." Zohran stood up. Minutes later, he walked outside past the press line. No speech, no stage. He found Leo, got on one knee, and looked him in the eye. "You're why we fight," Zohran said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the real fighter here." Leo smiled, eyes shining. "You didn't yell," he said. "You just told the truth." Zohran hugged him, and the cameras caught it. By sundown, a photo of Zohran and Leo holding hands was framed on the walls of community centers, union halls, and bodegas across the 5 boroughs. The State Assembly reopened its session in Albany that evening, but the room felt changed. The gallery seats, usually occupied by powerful real estate lobbyists, were conspicuously empty. Zohran walked in slowly, no tie, just his lapel pin and folded notes. People stood as he entered, not out of formality, but respect. Not a word was said until the speaker, pro tempore, whispered, "Assemblyman, would you like to speak?" Zohran looked around, eyes red, hearts wide open. He walked to the center of the chamber. "I didn't come to destroy a man," Zohran said. "I came to defend the people who no longer have a voice in these halls." He took a breath. "I'm not proud of what happened last night, but I am proud that our city finally looked itself in the mirror." And then he did something no one expected. He bowed his head in silence for 1 full minute. No sound, no politics, just silence. For the lives forgotten in spreadsheets, for the dreams stolen by a rent increase, for the voices lost in the noise of profit. And in that moment, even the most cynical politician felt something crack inside. Because silence, real silence, is sometimes louder than any speech. At sunrise, a lone man stood quietly on the steps of the Capitol in Albany. His name was Manny Vargas, a veteran of the Young Lords. His jacket was faded, his boots worn, but he held himself with dignity. In his hand was an old, battered bullhorn. Inside, Zohran was reviewing tenant case files. An aide walked in. "Sir, there's an activist outside. He says he doesn't want media." "Just a moment." Zohran stood and stepped outside. Manny nodded. Zohran returned the gesture. I buried my friend after he lost his apartment in the 80s, the old man said. They called him lazy. We knew the system was rigged. We used this bullhorn in the first rent strikes in the Bronx. He handed the bullhorn to Zohran. Yesterday your voice was louder than this ever was. You earned it. Zohran's voice cracked. I can't take this. You already did, the man said, when you spoke for the forgotten. Zohran held the bullhorn to his chest, eyes glassy. He returned to the chamber with the bullhorn resting on his desk. The country was watching. He approached the podium. I have one last file, he said, lifting a yellow envelope. This one is different. It's about a cover-up that reached deeper than any of us thought. Murmurs swept the room. Zohran opened the envelope. Inside were leaked internal communications. He looked directly into the camera. This file shows that Mr. Kirk's organization actively worked with this firm to create and spread misinformation, targeting tenant union leaders by name to intimidate them and their families into silence. A gasp. A fellow progressive assemblywoman stood up. That's a conspiracy to violate their civil rights. Zohran nodded. Yes, and it happened. I don't need to shout. I just need the truth to speak for itself. He placed the file on the desk and backed away. That was the moment when the truth stood taller than any man in that chamber. The reaction was immediate. Across New York, tears flowed like rivers, in homeless shelters, in public school classrooms, in firehouses, in the back of Uber cars. This wasn't politics anymore. It was about betrayal, and about finally being heard. A man in a shelter in Bushwick dropped to his knees and sobbed. A teacher in the South Bronx played Zohran's words on loop. Her class didn't look away once. And in apartments across the boroughs, people from different sides of the world sat together. Not arguing, but crying. Because what Zohran Mamdani had done wasn't scripted. It was truth delivered, calmly, fearlessly. And as the sun dipped again over the Capitol, a young girl in the Bronx wrote in her journal, "When I grow up, I want to be brave like Zohran." Charlie Kirk's show was suspended indefinitely. News anchors repeated the words, deliberate targeting of community organizers, abuse of nonprofit status, unforgivable. The AG's office buzzed with pressure. But Zohran wasn't in the spotlight anymore. He was at a hospital in the Bronx visiting Anna, the widow who had written to him. She had collapsed from exhaustion after attending a vigil. When Zohran arrived, she was asleep, but her son, about 10 years old, was awake. The boy looked up from a coloring book. "You're the man who told the truth," he said. Zohran knelt down. "I just said what your mom already knew," he replied softly. The boy smiled and handed him a small yellow toy taxicab. "Keep this," he said, "in case you need to get the truth somewhere fast again." Zohran took it, overcome, and for the second time in 24 hours, the assemblyman from Queens cried. Back in Albany, the Attorney General held a surprise press conference. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented and further corroborated testimonies, she announced, "We are moving forward with formal charges against Vulture Capital for conspiracy, fraud, and a pattern of illegal harassment." A ripple went through the crowd of reporters and activists. Furthermore, the AG continued, "We recognize Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani for his moral courage, his restraint, and for putting the people of New York before powerful special interests." Zohran had returned just in time to hear about it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The crowd of tenants and organizers in the room began to stand one by one, turning to him. A rare standing ovation, not of politicians, but of the people. Outside, news of the charges hit the airwaves like thunder. New Yorkers wept, not because a corporation was caught, but because someone had finally stood up when it mattered most. And as Zohran quietly exited the press conference, Manny, the veteran organizer he'd met earlier, whispered, "You didn't just speak for us. You reminded us that the movement still lives here." Zohran nodded, hand on his heart, and kept walking. By evening, the sounds of the city had changed. The call to prayer from a mosque in Astoria seemed to hang in the air a little longer. The rhythm of salsa from a block party in the Bronx felt more joyful. Families gathered on stoops and around kitchen tables, not for scandal, but for something sacred. Hope. In Washington Heights, a mother prayed over her dinner table and said, "God bless the man who spoke for us." In a dispatch center in Queens, a group of Sikh taxi drivers paused their work to raise their fists in solidarity. And in front of Zohran's district office, candles were placed on the steps in quiet tribute, not out of mourning but thanksgiving. Because in one single day, truth had taken its first real breath in years. Inside his small office, Zohran Mamdani sat quietly. No press, no noise. Just him and the little yellow toy taxi the boy had given him. He opened his notebook, wrote one word: organize. He didn't care if he was praised. He didn't care if he trended. All he cared about was the promise he made with that one sentence. While you mock my work for tenants, your largest corporate donor is evicting them. That line didn't just expose a man, it awakened a city. The next morning, New York woke differently. The anger had faded. Something else had taken its place. Solidarity. Subway conversations paused their usual noise. School assemblies held moments of reflection. City mayors quoted Zohran's words. Even late-night hosts stopped, joking. For once, the truth was too sacred to mock. Zohran Mamdani walked onto the steps of City Hall. Cameras flashed. No prepared speech. Just a folded piece of paper in his hand. He read from it slowly. The truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone brave enough to whisper it out loud. He folded the paper and looked at the sea of journalists. I didn't expose Charlie Kirk for revenge. I did it because silence was killing the city. I spoke for the rent-stabilized apartments, the underfunded hospital rooms, the taxi drivers, the widows, the children with nothing but hope left. He paused, then finished with a soft, steady breath. And I'll do it again if I have to. That clip was replayed everywhere. And once again, Zohran's voice didn't stir up division. It restored something New York thought it had lost: its heart. Later that night, Zohran quietly took the 7 train back to Queens. No cameras, no press, just him. He walked past a gleaming new luxury high-rise, a symbol of the gentrification he fought. He stopped, stared at its cold, empty lobby for a long while, then whispered, "Greed sat there." He kept walking. Outside a community center in the Bronx, Leo, the little boy from the rally, was there again. His mom wheeled him forward, holding a folded drawing. Zohran knelt down. Leo handed him the picture. It showed Zohran standing on a subway platform. Behind him were tiny stick figures of every color with signs that said truth, hope, my mom, my block, justice. Zohran's eyes filled. I didn't get to this platform alone, he whispered. You all pushed me up. Leo smiled. You didn't scream, you just stood. Zohran hugged him tight, gently, then stood and looked up at the Bronx skyline. I didn't come here to win, he whispered. I came here to serve. And for once, those words weren't just political. They were pure and real. A week didn't pass, not even a full day, but everything changed. Zohran returned to his apartment that night. No parade, no spotlight, just family and silence. He sat on his fire escape as the wind blew gently, watching the city lights. Then came a knock. It was Anna with her son. I had to say thank you in person, she said. Zohran shook his head, emotion rising. I didn't do much. She placed her hand on his. You gave a broken city a voice again. Her son looked up. You made my mom believe again. That's when Zohran finally broke. One tear rolled down his face. Not for glory, not for politics, but for every email, every handshake, every hug from someone who thought they'd never matter. He had carried them all quietly until the very end. If this story moved you, even just one sentence of it, then let your heart speak. Like this video if Zohran Mamdani inspired you today. Comment below if this made you feel something real, and tell us who you think Zohran stood for. Subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us what courage, solidarity, and justice truly look like. Together, let's keep telling stories that empower, not divide. This is your moment to organize. Don't stay silent.